turn on their thing and tell me that they see that?
I see it. This is he.
Okay.
I see it.
I see
Okay.
it.
I
All
see
right.
it.
That's good. Okay. So what we're going to do in this Wednesday class for the next few weeks is look at a book by Marcus Borg called Days of Awe and Wonder. Now, Marcus Borg died in 2015, and this book was published in 2017, I think. So obviously, it is not something that he did actively. It's really prepared by his wife, Marianne, from some of his works that he had not published and some things that he had published. It's kind of a compilation. And it's how to be a Christian in the 21st century. That's kind of the title of that, how to be a Christian in the 21st century. And that's, I think, important for us as going forward. This is a picture of Marcus Borg. He grew up a Lutheran in a conservative Lutheran church in Minnesota, and but joined the Episcopal Church as an adult. And so he is an Episcopalian, as we might put it. And his take on how the church is changing and what it's changing into is one of the, he's one of the leading figures in that. And when I say emerging church, I'm really talking about the emerging church in the mainline denominations. The more conservative churches also have an emerging church understanding, but it's very different, I think, than the mainline. But he's one of the mainline leaders in this, I would say. He went to his doctoral degree, came from Oxford, and there was another fellow there that some of you may know. His name was N.T. Wright. N.T. Wright is perhaps the leading New Testament scholar in today's world, I would say. And he is, he was Bishop of Durham for a while, but he's written lots of things. We did the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of Matthew with him, and he does a wonderful job with that. Now, what happened is that Marcus Borg was one of the members of what is called the Jesus Seminar in the 1990s. And Marcus Borg was one of the leading people in that and wrote prolifically about Jesus and a new understanding of Jesus and so forth. And so he was one of those people that became popular actually because of that. Well, N.T. Wright did not agree with everything that he said, and these two guys are actually friends because they were in Oxford together. And so N.T. Wright represents the conservative side, and Marcus Borg represents what we would call the progressive side of the mainline churches, especially our church, the Episcopal Church. You remember the discussion we had about levels of consciousness. N.T. Wright is writing from a modern consciousness and historical critical method of discovering the stuff about the Bible in terms of, what the setting is, what was going on at the time, what's the perspective of the person writing this material and what that means in that sense. And that's why he's so popular, because he does a wonderful job of that. Marcus Borg, on the other hand, is the more metaphorical way of looking at the Bible, which is kind of a postmodern consciousness. Both of them are very important in the religious life today, especially for the Episcopal Church. First chapter that we're going to talk about with this book, and if you don't have the book, we do have a few copies at the church that you can get, or you can certainly get it online or on Kindle and that kind of stuff. We can talk with me about that afterwards. But Listening to the Spirit is the first chapter, and I think probably one of the most important ones. This is the one that really caught my attention because it outlines in a way that is understandable kind of some of the problems with modern understanding of things. And so we'll kind of go into that and you'll see what I'm talking about that. The word spirit in English is actually a translation of the Hebrew word ruach. And in Greek, it's the word pneuma. Now, if you're an old person like me, you may remember, in fact, that the old pneumatic tires back in the 1950s and 40s, actually, that was a new kind of tire. It actually had air in them. And pneuma actually means air in motion, just as ruach means air in motion. Now, what we think about when we talk about air in motion is wind, for instance. And in the setting of the Middle East, there's several components to that. What they would have in mind is things like the cool breeze that comes off the Mediterranean when it's really hot in the deserts, that kind of peaceful, quieting, kind of almost comfortable feeling you would have. And then, of course, wind is also resistance, where you are running against the wind or trying to walk against the wind, or walking with the wind too, that when you're in the flow, things kind of change. And this is a metaphor, of course. God is not wind, or the Spirit is not wind, but the Spirit is like wind. That is, it has these kind of components to it of kind of comfort and peace, the sense of resistance when we're going the wrong way, the sense of further movement when we're going the right way, so to speak. And then breath is also associated with this air in motion, this spirit, and that kind of connects us with life. Breathing in and out is kind of one of the ways of thinking about that. The other is that when we speak and say words, breath is also a part of that. So the word and the spirit, air in motion, are kind of intimately connected. And this is how they see that. This wisdom of God is very much connected to the Spirit of God in that sense. So these are kind of the ways of understanding spirit. And this is important because spirit is probably the one thing that we have left out the most in the church today. We have been through the Protestant Reformation, which focused on the Word, on Jesus as the Word in one sense, but more or less about the Bible being the Word. And that's kind of led us in a kind of an interesting direction, I think, for the church. And we've kind of lost that sense of spirit. The charismatic movement of the 60s and 70s is kind of trying to recover that. And we'll talk about that later in this discussion, later in the book. It's an interesting part. Mysticism is also one of the things we'll be talking about, because they are different ways of trying to introduce spirit into a world that's really become very dry with the word, kind of, in a sense, I think, lost much of the spirit. Now, what Borg is trying to say in this book is that there are actually two worlds. The world of everyday experience, which we all know pretty well, and the world of spirit. There is this primordial tradition in most cultures and most religions, including the Bible, that there are these two separate worlds that are intimately connected. There's this visible world disclosed to us by ordinary sense perception, but there's also another reality, a second world of non-material reality that's charged with energy and power. We delineate these sometimes as sacred and profane, as holy and mundane, as God and world. That's the way the Bible would put it. The world we know pretty well. Science has kind of made us look at things in a material way lately. And since actually the 17th century, that's been the case. That what we have done is to kind of made the world that we see, the material world, the only world that we really pay any attention to. We We think everything is about the material world, and we know how it works. We know the laws by which it works by, and sometimes we kind of put God out there somewhere in the heavens because we think that no one needs God. Everything works the way it's supposed to work. But the Bible and Marcus Borg in his work here is trying to help us to see that no, this spiritual world is a reality. And in fact, it is more real than the world that we see. And in fact, it is the source of the world that we see. As Borg puts it, this other world of spirit is not simply an article of belief, not something that we just understand. It's something we can experience. Now, we at church here, CHC, have put it in, we did about maybe 3 or 4 years ago, we did a whole series on a movement from knowing about God, which is what the Reformation was about, to knowing God, which is what this is about here. It's not just an article of belief that we believe that there's a spirit. We can in fact experience that spirit. That is what I think is the important part here. That's part of what the 60s and 70s charismatic movement was about too, I think, was trying to experience the spirit through music, through different means of healing and so forth. Now, there are places in our experience where we see these two worlds intersecting, as we might put it. The ancient Celts called it thin places, where heaven and earth meet, or where the spirit and the regular world, ordinary world meet. We would talk about lots of places in the Celtic world. Iona, the island of Iona is part of that, but just forests were one of the sacred places for them. Mountains were a sacred place for them. We might think about lakes and beaches and gardens. Some of the things that we can't do now is go to see those things. But again, that's part of what this is about. The ordinary world and the spirit world kind of come together in a sense. Another way of putting this, and this comes from James Allison, not from Marcus Borg, but I think it's a good way of thinking about this. He talks about the social other and another other. The social other is kind of the what we might call the culture that we live in, and there's a lot of good things about that. Good things like having a fresh water supply, having a food supply, shelter, clothing, and so forth. But then he also notes that there is some difficult things about that, because living in a social other, there's also war and violence and social stratification. There's a sense of shame and guilt that we experience. And this all comes, of course, in the Bible from the Adam and Eve story. It was a description of this, of how things are not quite right because of this. We live in a rivalistic world where we try to place the blame on other people. We try to take the dark side of ourselves, or the things that we don't like about ourselves, and project them on somebody else. It's a kind of a place that's not so nice. It can be very restrictive and very oppressive for lots of folks. But there are ways to get out of that. Music is one of them. When that Italian opera singer sang Amazing Grace a few weeks ago out in Italy, in the courtyard there, that was one of those moments. We're so involved in this coronavirus mess and the people dying and sick and all that, and it's really been terrible. And to hear those words and the way that he sang it was just like took us out of that whole thing. It kind of made us feel like we were in a different world. And again, that's the world of spirit. Art does that as well in lots of people, lots of thin places, I think, for all of us. So one of the things that we're doing here, the ordinary world, spirit world, this is a quote from Rumi, who is an Islamic mystic or a Sufi, part of Sufism in that sense, which is 13th century Islamic person. He says, step out of the circle of time, which he's talking about the ordinary world, and into the circle of love. That's another way of putting this difference, the ordinary world and spirit world. It is the ordinary world of time and a spirit world of love. We talked about this several times when we talked about the spirit world as consciousness with Chardin. Remember Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who talks about that its consciousness is really the love that we are talking about. It is a consciousness which brings about empathy, compassion, self-offering love for one another, and justice as well in that sense. So let's pause for just a minute. If you will turn your lights back on, so to speak. I will turn this off and we can turn your microphones back on, and see you now. So what we're going to do is if anybody would like to make a comment or say something, ask questions or whatever, we'll take a time to do that. And I can't see everybody at once, so you'll just have to speak up and have to be careful not to overstep your bounds.
Chris, there is an option to raise your hand. If you go to participants, wherever you see that, there should be, I don't know if you're, at the bottom of the list of participants, you'll see three little things: invite, mute me, and raise hand. And so, like if I hit raise hand,
Oh, I see.
it's going to tell you my hand's up and that I want to say something. And so that way you can call on people and keep everybody from talking at the same time so we can hear people.
That's great. I don't have that on mine for some reason.
I don't either.
Participants.
Yeah. So, okay. So if you will go down there and raise your hand, then that will help us to make sure that the person talking is the one doing it. If you can see that.
Rich, you have to call on them when they raise their hand.
Well, I don't have anybody. Have you raising your hand is the only one I have.
Yeah, I just did that to show you how it would happen.
Yeah.
So that way we don't all talk at the same time.
Right.
And we get to hear each other. But you'll see hands coming up now. That means that person wants to say something. So you would say, Jane has something to offer. And then she can talk and everyone else will listen to Jane.
Okay. Okay, Jane is actually talking. Okay, Jane. Go ahead.
Am I on?
Yes, you're on.
Okay, well, I don't know if this is the feedback that you were looking for, but the whole thin space that we studied a couple of years ago, I had an experience like that. I went with my son, my one who struggles, and he and I went on a trip to Rwanda. And one of the things that we did was we climbed the mountains, maybe 3 hours into the mountains with a guide to see the mountain gorillas. And you have to stay completely quiet, but you can look at them right in the eye. That's not an issue. You can look right in their eyes, and their eyes are so human, and they are so close to you, and they're interacting with each other, with a baby, with the with the silverback, and just up there in the mountains, totally silent. It was definitely for me the definition of a thin space. And that's all I wanted to say. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I don't know that many of us had that kind of experience, you know, with gorillas. But
Yeah.
that's great. Great to hear. Anybody else have something?
Quiet bunch.
Okay. Allison, you have something?
No, but
Okay.
it's interesting listening.
Okay.
What you've been saying.
Okay. Okay, Beth, you have something? You're gonna have to undo your microphone, Beth. Your microphone is off.
Just to go up to the top.
Mhm.
Okay. I wanted to wait until she can get it off. It's not simple. I don't think Melissa's there. So,
Looks like Susan has her. No.
okay. Susan, would you like to say something?
Van Buren, this Susan, I don't.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes, I feel very in sync with what you're saying, and I think you can also include a physical body experience, because I have felt that primarily when I was younger and I could ski. Going down a mountain was, just the wind in my face.
Yeah.
It was magical.
Yeah. Yeah.
Way of saying it. It was hitting a world that was just so different from my everyday life.
Right.
And thing with going up on a chairlift, if you're alone and you're looking at the trees and the snow and the sky and everything, it's absolutely magical. And not everyone has that same experience. I don't know who the gorilla lady was, but whoever was talking about gorillas, that was her experience. But I feel that the bodily issues are very important also. Well, hers was sight. Mine was just movement.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree. That there are experiences like that, especially outdoors, because you get out of the tit for tat world, in the sense of you get what you deserve, and you get down on yourself, and you feel guilt and shame and so forth. But when you're out there skiing, that's gone.
Yeah.
You don't feel that. It's a different world, and that gives us a sense of that spirit connection, I think, because you really have to let go of the other world in order to feel that world. In that sense.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, Beth, I think you are open now.
Do I have, you can hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, I think when you first see your baby that was just born, or when you see, if you're watching a dog give birth to a litter of puppies, when you first see that puppy born,
Yeah.
those,
Okay.
those are that kind of a space.
Yeah, I agree.
Hard to remember back. It's been so long ago since I had a baby. But I think that is, and it isn't like it is now. I mean, they didn't give you the baby till it was all wrapped up and ready to
Right.
go, in those days. But I think the way they do it now, it must be a really thin space for a mother when they, just delivered and they put the baby on top of her like they do now and all that. I mean, because you're awake.
Yeah.
In my day, you weren't awake at all. But I think that would be a thin space.
Okay, good. I think Ann Hainan, you'll have to turn your microphone on, Ann.
Okay.
There we go. Okay.
I was sitting here thinking about the fact that after Tom died, I was very, I felt like I was cut off from my regular life. And I have noticed, and I have tried to notice things that come into my life that impact me in a positive way. And I will say this, that it has happened several times that I have been feeling kind of low, and the phone will ring and there will be a friend that I haven't heard from in a long time who just wants to say hello And I just can't tell you, that just feels like that must be the Spirit coming into my life. And I feel
Yeah.
like I do recognize that when it happens.
Yeah. I think, definitely
Very
think so. Yeah, thank you, Ann. I agree that I think that is there's a connection that is kind of in that spirit world that connects us that we don't quite understand, and I think that's part of it. That there are times when we find those connections like that. Very much so. Anybody else?
Kim.
Kim Pico.
Kim? Okay.
I would say I definitely experience spirit in nature, especially with the seasons. Just in terms of the processes, you know, winter, spring, summer, fall, kind of metaphorically with resurrection and new birth and
Yeah.
that kind of thing. But I also try to spend some time just listening for God. I don't do it every day, but I try to do it frequently. And we'll just sit. So I guess it's kind of just meditating. And I often find that I'm given images. And, you know, I may not understand what they mean, or I'm given words. And so I'll spend time kind of looking up definitions of what that word means and see how it might apply to where I am in life or whatever. But I definitely feel spirit very closely in that way.
Yeah, thank you, Kim. That's a good point, because that's actually what the next week we're going to talk about. Mysticism is what that category of, which we haven't really talked about much. But mysticism is kind of this getting in touch with that spirit world in that kind of way, basically. And we're going to talk about faith and mysticism next week, the next chapter 2 and 3, actually. So we'll be talking more about that. So keep that in mind. But yes, that's another way that we get out of the workaday world, the tit for tat world, all the oppression that we feel and the shame and guilt and all those feelings that really just keep us focused on ourselves, basically, and to get in touch with that connection of spirit that connects all of us, the compassionate, empathetic, loving spirit in that sense. So if anybody else have anything, we'll move on and let me do the next section of this, and then we'll have time afterwards to talk some more. So hold your questions for a while. And I'm going to put us back on the slideshow. And then, and it's taking me some time to work this out. So, let's see, I think I messed it up.
Some people haven't picture. Okay.
I haven't gotten all this down yet, so I'm sliding to where we're going here. Okay. So what I want to do, this second section, this is part of what he does, and which I think was very interesting to me, at least. And that is to focus on those thin spaces that are a part of the Bible, the stories in the Bible that actually are thin spaces, as we might put it. Again, the Bible has lots of these. The ones that we think about mostly are Mount Sinai, for instance. And this is a picture of modern, what people think is Mount Sinai in the desert. Libby and I were there back in 2000. It was a rough looking country, I'll tell you. It was dry as it can be, a desert with mountains, basically. And but this is a place where Moses, Elijah, many others really experienced the presence of God. Moses, remember, in a burning bush that was not consumed in that sense, which is a kind of a different way of thinking about God, another image of God in that sense. Another place is the Ark of the Covenant. After the Exodus, the the children of Israel were asked to build this ark, which was supposed to be the throne of God, the invisible Yahweh, I am. The burning bush voice of God recognizes that God is I am, or I am who I am, kind of a ground of being, or the state of being, rather than another object in the universe, so to speak, which is what we would actually call monotheism. And that's an important part of the revelation that we see in the Old Testament, is moving from one God among many to the sense that there is just one God, one reality in that sense. But the ark, it's one of those places they believe that God was. In that sense, God was present with them as they traveled through the desert. The Ark of the Covenant was actually put in Solomon's temple at one point in time, and it's in the Holy of Holies, the very center of that. But the temple then became the kind of the center of where the presence of God was, in that sense, where heaven and earth met. In fact, they would call that the navel of the earth, navel in the sense of connected, with an umbilical cord to God, so to speak. Lots of different religious traditions thought the same way in that sense. Thought about the temple or the sacred places as kind of the navel of the earth, or that part. We use analogic language when we talk about God. Father, mother, king, shepherd, burning bush that's not consumed, and so forth. And this is important. God is not, quote, a father or mother, a king, a shepherd, or burning bush, but God is, in one sense, like those. Like a nurturing father or nurturing mother, like a king who leads us, a shepherd who leads us. A burning bush that's not consumed is a little bit more difficult to understand, I think. But it really is talking about, a presence that is eternal, that's always there, isn't consumed or burned up. It's part of that sense of being omnipresent, I guess you would say. Other thing to remember is that the spirit world, or the spirit, is alive and personal. God is alive and personal. God is not somewhere else, even though there are a sense sometimes that we think about God as being a person because we need to. It's easier for us to relate to a person than just a spirit, so to speak. And sometimes we think about God as being up in heaven, and the Bible has lots of those categories too. That's the way they thought about things in those days. They had a kind of a sense of a flat earth with a firmament over heaven, a dome, so to speak. And above the dome was where God was. And the interesting thing about that, though, in the Bible is that what happened in heaven was intimately connected with what happens on earth. That is, if there was a war on earth, it was because there was a war in heaven. So even though they were separate, they were still intimately connected. The way we would see it now is, as Pierre Teilhard de Chardin puts it, that God is the within of things. God is that which is the depths of things. Something that we really can't see, we can't understand perhaps, but is the ground of being in that sense. So what we would say is that God is immanent, present everywhere, in all things. God is transcendent, more than the things of the earth, not to be identified with any particular thing, or not even the sum total of things, as Borg puts it, but beyond those things. So God is in all things, and we are in God, as we put it. And that is called panentheism, which is a word just coined recently in that sense, that it wasn't, hadn't been around before. Pantheism is a belief that God is things, or things are God. Panentheism is saying that God is in all things. In Hebrew scripture, we see lots of this understanding of the spirit world being intimately connected with our world. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth is a good example of that. That after the exile, when they were having to worship or forced to worship or saw others worshiping a violent God, they began to write a passage of creation about what they believed about God. And this is a God who loves, a God who sees the goodness of things in that sense and is intimately connected with it all. And there are several other kinds of instances of thin spaces, as we might put it. Abraham, who is the father of Judaism and father of Islam and also the father of Christianity in one sense, had an experience of three people coming to him while he was out in the desert, wandering around, going to the place that God would show him. And these three men actually kind of tell him or bring the news to him that he and his wife are going to have a child. And so he begins to see them as messengers of God. And that's why they're depicted here with wings. It's not that they had wings when they visited. They were like normal men in that sense that visited him and sat down with them and ate with them and so forth, and then revealed this to them. But an angel is a messenger of God. When you depict it in a painting, though, you add wings because that means that's an angel and so forth. So this is a metaphorical way of talking or describing what had happened. And then we have Jacob's ladder. This is after Jacob takes all everything of his brother Esau, kind of bamboozles them out of his heritage and all that, and he has to run away because Esau is after him. He sits down in the middle of the desert and has this dream of a ladder going to heaven. Now this is more like a stairway, like Stairway to Heaven, like Led Zeppelin might have seen, perhaps. But this is kind of the sense of connection, that he didn't know that this place out in the middle of the desert was really a thin space. It was where heaven and earth meet and so forth. And this is a good, I think, painting of that. And then there's Isaiah, and we're going to talk a lot about Isaiah Isaiah is probably, of the prophets, he is probably the most important of the prophets. He's certainly the most influential when it comes to Jesus. And this is the first part of his call as a prophet. And it's very interesting. He's actually in a worship services, as we would say, in the temple during a worship service, and the whole thing comes alive for him. And in the year that King Uzziah died, and this King Uzziah was one of the good kings. There were a lot of bad kings in those days, but he was one of the good kings. And when he died, it was really a blow to everybody in Israel. And he was in a worship service and saw, as it says here, the Lord sitting on a throne, high and lofty. The hem of his robe filled the temple. Seraphs, which is a kind of the angels, were in attendance above him. Each had 6 wings. With 2, they covered their faces. With 2, they covered their feet. And with 2, they flew. And one called to another and said, "Holy, holy, holy, and the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory." The pivots on the threshold shook in the voices of those who called, and the house was filled with smoke. This is a depiction of that. There's lots of different of these. Just as a note, the wings that covered their face and the wings that cover their feet. Feet is a euphemism for genitals, and you will notice that they're really covering the genitals, not the feet in that sense. And you see the robe that's kind of filling the place, and you see the throne there that's kind of blurred, so to speak, like smoke and so forth. What happened, and this is what I think is important to note when we're looking at the Bible. if you were to be there with him, you might not have seen anything. This is something that he experienced. And it was a deep experience of this spirit world coming in touch with him and calling him. And it was so intense and so beyond belief for him that he couldn't describe it. It's not describable. So what he does afterwards is come back and begin to express what he felt, how he was experienced, how he experienced the presence of God there and so forth. And this is imagery that people would have understood in those days. The most important part, I think, is this next part. Then one of the seraphs flew to me holding a live coal that had been taken from the altar with a pair of tongs. The seraph touched my mouth with it and said, "Now that this has touched your lips, your guilt has departed and your sin is blotted out." This is his experience, that the coals on the altar were holy. And when that coal touched his lips, he felt forgiven. Now, whether or not that happened or it was a dream, whatever, we don't know. But what was important about this is that his guilt was forgiven and he was opened into a freedom to respond to this call of God to be a prophet in that sense. So this is a very powerful, this perhaps in the prophets, one of the most powerful kind of depictions of call. And Isaiah was kind of at the top of the list of the prophets in my experience. Paul of Tarsus also had a mystical experience, and he talks about this. I know a person in Christ. He's actually the person that he's talking about. I know a person in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up in the third heaven. Whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And I know that such a person, whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know, God knows, was caught up into paradise and heard things that are not to be told, that no mortal is permitted to repeat. Paul's experience is one of this kind of sense of meditation that we were talking about that brought him into a different realm, out of the world and into a different world, the spirit world, as we would put it. I think his conversion experience is that same way. His conversion really knocked him down. He had been persecuting the Christians, and then all of a sudden, this Christ comes to him, this risen Jesus comes to him and says, "Why are you persecuting me?" And he is just transformed from that, from killing Christians to beginning to make everybody else a Christian. I mean, that's a big transformation, and certainly one that's important in the Bible in that sense. One of the things that Marcus Borg points out in this is that all of this about the spirit world is kind of a collision with our way of seeing things. Our modern world has really kind of changed the way that we understand our world. The scientific method of kind of dividing things up, being able to see that how this works, how that works, the forces that are always working, the forces of motion, of thermodynamics, all of those things that Newton discovered and so forth. And it's really kind of taken the spirit out of the world for us. It's become a one-dimensional world. And what he's trying to say, I think, is that the world is more than just pieces of stuff that go around. That below all of that is something very powerful. The way we would put it probably comes from quantum physics. That quantum physics, I think, has been a real gift to the church. A gift because it's helped us to see that the reality that Newton kind of described, the macro world, as we would put it, the world of our lives, is very different in the micro world. That is, below what we see is something even greater than we thought, and that it's very different than we thought. That everything in the micro world is interconnected. There is nothing that's not in relationship with something else. The macro world appears to be separate, but what the micro world is telling us is no, it's all connected. Everything is connected. It's also saying to us, I think, something about the sense that when at the very beginning levels, when if we would go back to the Big Bang, for instance, and energy comes out of nowhere, so to speak, what that energy does, first thing, is to come into relationship with other particles of energy to form matter, form subatomic particles that come into relationship to form atoms. That the underlying reality is this interconnectedness that is beyond our seeing, but is the true reality. That, I think, helps us to understand the spirit world of the ancient people and the spirit world that we still have. That it's an underlying reality of connectedness that we don't see, but is there. And when we feel a part of it, it connects us to everything. We live in a world that we feel disconnected, that we are isolated. And gosh, during this coronavirus, isn't that the truth? That we feel, we don't feel close to people. We see people, and glad we have things like this to do so that we can make sure that everybody's still doing well, and also in that, but we don't feel connected. But this underlying reality, the spirit world, as we begin to pray and meditate and begin to move away and out of the congestion and the isolation and the conditional love and so forth, tit for tat world, and come into the love that God has, that we can experience and be a part of, it changes us. It changes us, and it can move us into responding to God's will for us, whatever that might be. And it doesn't have to be anything miraculous. It can be just having empathy and compassion for someone next to us, or it can be a call to a particular avocation or vocation or whatever. It's a broad spectrum of things, but it gets us in touch with kind of God's empathy, God's compassion, and God's love for us all. So I'll end there, and I'll turn us back on again, and we can kind of wind this up. Any comments or questions or things we might share at this point? Raise your hand. I'll try to see your hand raised up, or you can try to hit the bottom thing. Yes, Sue Van Buren.
Yeah, Chris, when you were talking in the first section, this struck me, and I remembered this, that when you have an experience of thinness, however you want to call it, to me, it's an experience of oneness. I'm not separated from anything. I'm at one with myself, with the world, with the spirit. And that's what I was trying to convey with my experience of skiing. I felt so one with the world and with the real world, etc. And it was just beautiful. You just didn't want it to go away.
Right.
You just wanted to stay there. It was wonderful.
Right. I think then we're going to talk about that next week some more, but that's exactly what we're talking about. The connection with the spirit world it's really a sense of being a part of it all, not being separate at all, being part of it all. Feeling loved is a way of expressing that, feeling at one with everything around us. And we'll talk about that more next week. But yeah, that's exactly what this thin space is about, thin place is about. Anybody? Okay, Susie Goffrey.
That's me. Can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Oh, good. I'm going to sort of change the topic like I usually do. I just wanted to say that I enjoyed that concert so much. Andrea Bocelli,
Yeah,
singing Amazing Grace. That was just standing there. And he's, he's blind, has been
I didn't know
blind.
that.
Oh, he's
No.
complete. Yeah, he was hit in the face with a soccer ball when he was a child.
Really?
And I just think he's amazing. And that
Yeah.
I just was in tears, that was just, talk about a religious experience.
It was,
That's right.
it was, yeah, it was.
It was.
And why? It was because music does that for us. It
Oh.
brings us out of the workaday world and the tit for tat world and into a different realm of being. And that, it did it for us. It did it for me too. I agree, Sue.
Good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. Lovely.
Who else? Yeah, Judy Urban. Judith.
Yeah. Don't you think part of it was the spirit with his, that brought the spirit to us with his singing? I thought it was very moving too.
Yeah.
Yes.
Part
Well,
of the spirit.
he is he sings with spirit, doesn't he? I mean, it's like
Yeah. He does.
it was beyond beautiful, I thought, in the way
Yeah,
that
it
how
was.
can you do that? It was just but yeah, and it was very, you could tell that his whole body and his whole self was in that, which was important.
I think you can get it on YouTube. I think it was.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can.
Again.
Listen to it tonight, right now.
Okay, Beth, did you have something to say?
I thought the part where he was in the cathedral with the empty cathedral was just the best part of all Easter.
Okay, yeah, that was another part. The part that I saw the first was the Amazing Grace part, but yes, the part in the cathedral itself was also very beautiful in the same way.
He
Right.
walked out and he sang Amazing Grace in English while everything else had been sung in Latin. And I thought it
Yeah, okay,
was
okay,
amazing.
yeah.
I mean, it was Easter.
It was on Easter, yeah.
Yeah, and I
Yeah.
thought it was the best thing of all Easter.
Sure was.
Anybody else? Anybody else have something to say?
I do. Judith Urban.
Okay, Judith? Yeah, go ahead.
So many times I'll be thinking of something and I feel like the spirit is really talking to me when I'm thinking about a person or something that's happened. And I feel that's what you're conveying here, that the spirit is with us when
Right.
all of a sudden maybe you'll do that and then that person will call you or you'll call them or you'll see them or with other things like that, or something will happen. I feel like it's, a lot of times I'll say it's God's grace, but I think it's the spirit that's come to us.
Yeah, I think that's part of the I think the important insight in the Bible is that this and probably the imagery that we get in the Bible, it gets in the way of this, because every time they have an experience, they describe it in such a way that it doesn't look like that's going to happen to me. You know what I mean? Like a voice coming out of a burning bush.
Yeah.
But the truth is, I think that what happened to them is the same kinds of things that happened to us. That we look back on an event and we begin to express it in different ways than we would when it happened, because it became so important. We began to see that, heck, this really was what I needed to do, or this really what I was called to do at this time, and then we look back on it and think about that moment with more clarity about what was really happening, that we were really connected to the Spirit in that sense. So I think that's part of what Marcus Borg does very well, and that is to help us to see the reality of the experiences and not think about them in this kind of showy way, because the showy way is really trying to just express with symbols that the people knew at the time what it meant, as opposed to maybe what actually happened, and we'll talk about this some more, but the facts are important.
I just want to say one more thing.
Truth is sometimes deeper than the facts. Yeah, go ahead, Susie.
I'm just so glad to see you all.
Yeah,
It's been so wonderful. It's the best
Yeah.
day ever. Thank you so much.
All right.
it is good to see everybody,
Yeah.
much so.
Well, thank you, Chris, for doing it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This
Good.
is wonderful, Chris.
If you need copies of the book, we've got a few left in the office, and you can certainly get it online. We'll be doing it much like this, so you don't necessarily have to have the book, but the book does go into lots of things that are, I think, very important for us this time. So we'll be working on that. So we'll meet again next week at the same time, and I think I'll end up sending you out another invitation, but I think you can use the same number. This is a recurring meeting, so you can use the same number. If we change things, I'll certainly let you know. I've got
Chris?
your emails and so forth. Yeah.
Chris, can we get copies of your PowerPoint at some point? Or like the text of the PowerPoint anyway?
Yeah, what the deal is, I recorded this, so I don't know what that means, how you get in touch with it. But yes, we have copies of the PowerPoint we can get to, but we also recorded this session just to see how that works, and we will eventually see what that means. I don't know exactly, and we're still studying this, still learning how to work this. So hang in with us. We'll kind of continue with it. Okay.
Okay.
You're doing a great job.
This is terrific.
This is
Thank you all.
amazing.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you,
you.
Chris.
Bye.
Next
Bye.
week.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.
Yeah, you just push the leave meeting part and you're gone, and I'll wait until everybody is finished.
Of course, I don't even see the leave meeting part.